Welcome to your deep dive. Today, we're going deep on Nicolae Ceaușescu,
Oh, yeah.
Romania's last communist leader.
Right.
And we've got some really fascinating Wikipedia excerpts here that you've dug up.
Yeah.
They really paint a picture of this guy's life, his policies, and then
Oh, yeah.
and then ultimately his downfall.
Yeah, it's a wild story. We're going to trace his path all the way from,
Okay.
humble beginnings as a shoemaker
Right.
all the way to the head of state. And then we'll get into some of those really controversial policies.
Okay.
Like his attempt to boost Romania's population.
Yeah.
And then also those ambitious economic ventures, which
Yeah.
didn't quite go as planned.
And we can't forget about the Romanian Revolution.
Oh, absolutely.
How does a man who's initially lauded for standing up to the Soviets
Right.
end up facing a firing squad on Christmas Day?
Yeah.
That's what we're here to find out.
Yeah, absolutely. A story full of twists and turns, that's for sure.
So let's unpack this, starting with his early life.
Okay.
I mean, it's pretty wild to think that he started as a shoemaker's apprentice
Yeah.
and ended up leading an entire nation.
Yeah, his journey is remarkable.
Yeah.
It really starts back in his teenage years when he joined the Romanian Communist Youth Movement,
Oh, wow.
became involved in various activities, and was even imprisoned
Oh, wow.
for some of his activities.
Yeah.
And it's actually there that he meets his future mentor, George Udej.
Okay.
They were cellmates in the Targu internment camp.
Wow. Talk about a pivotal moment.
Yeah.
So this mentorship, set him on the path to power.
Yeah. I mean, it was definitely a key factor.
Yeah.
So after the war, Romania comes under Soviet influence.
Right.
And Ceausescu very quickly starts climbing through the ranks, holding positions in the Ministry of Agriculture,
Right.
and even becoming the Deputy Minister of National Defense.
Wow.
And remember, he had no prior military experience.
That's a big leap from shoemaker to general.
Yeah.
What about his political savvy? How did he actually maneuver his way into leadership?
He was very skilled at navigating the political landscape of the time.
Okay.
When George Udej died in 1965,
Right.
Ceausescu was elected general secretary,
Okay.
partly because he was seen as kind of a compromise candidate.
Oh.
There's a lot of infighting amongst more senior officials.
So he kind of flipped in under the radar while everyone else was battling it out?
Yeah, you could say that.
Okay.
But once in power, he moved quickly to consolidate his position.
Okay.
So in 1967, he becomes president of the state council,
Right.
which effectively makes him the head of state.
Oh, wow.
So very shrewd operator, no doubt.
And in those early years, he was actually quite popular, right?
Yes,
Both within Romania and even internationally.
that's right. Ceausescu gained a reputation for independence,
Okay.
particularly in his dealings with the Soviet Union. He relaxed censorship, distanced Romania from the Warsaw Pact,
Wow.
and even publicly condemned the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968.
His speech in August,
Oh, yeah.
the 21st, I think it was?
August 21st. Yeah, that was a defining moment.
It really was.
That speech solidified his image as a reformer, as a maverick,
Yeah.
within the communist bloc.
Right.
He even traveled to Prague to show support for Alexander Dubček
Right.
before the invasion. So,
Yeah.
Really making a statement there.
So he's a communist leader,
Mm-hmm.
but not a Soviet puppet. He's walking a tightrope here.
Exactly. And in fact, he made efforts to cultivate relationships with the West,
Okay.
visiting countries like the United States, France, the UK.
Wow.
He was positioning himself as a leader on the world stage.
And all of this was part of his grand vision to transform Romania into a global power.
Precisely.
Okay.
That ambition fueled many of his policies, but
Yeah.
it also unfortunately led to some disastrous consequences that we'll get into.
One policy that stands out, and not in a good way, is Decree 770.
Yes.
This was his attempt to boost the birth rate. What was the thinking behind that?
Oh, on the surface, it might have seemed logical.
Okay.
Romania had a low birth rate, so Ceausescu restricted abortion and contraception,
Wow.
believing that this would lead to more babies, a larger workforce, a stronger nation.
But that backfired spectacularly, didn't it?
It did, while the population did initially increase.
Okay.
The policy had some horrific unintended consequences.
Right.
Many families simply couldn't afford to raise so many children,
Yeah.
leading to widespread child abandonment and horrific conditions in overcrowded orphanages.
Just heartbreaking to imagine those children suffering as a result of this decree.
Yeah.
It's a stark reminder of how policies can have devastating ripple effects.
It is a tragic example of how Ceausescu's desire for a larger population came at the expense of the well-being of the most vulnerable.
And this wasn't his only policy that had unintended consequences, right? I mean, his economic policies, especially in the 1970s, ultimately devastated Romania's economy.
His economic policies ultimately had a devastating impact.
Yeah.
One key example is his obsession with turning Romania into an oil refining giant.
You're talking about like his ambitious plans to build all those refineries.
Exactly. He saw the oil crisis of the early 70s and the rising oil prices as a golden opportunity.
Okay.
Took out massive loans from Western banks,
Wow.
over $13 billion,
Wow.
to invest in these refining plants.
He was betting big on oil.
He believed that once those plants were operational, the profits would be huge,
Right.
enough to pay off the debts and then some.
Yeah.
He envisioned Romania as a major player in the global energy market.
Of course, things didn't quite work out that way.
Not at all. By the time the plants were built, oil prices had plummeted.
Oh, no.
And then, to make matters worse, the devastating earthquake in 1977
Right.
caused further delays and complications.
So he's stuck with these enormous debts.
Yeah.
An oil refining plant that's failing.
Mm-hmm.
What did he do?
Well, to try and repay the loans, he implemented drastic austerity measures.
And these measures hit the Romanian people incredibly hard.
They did food rationing, energy restrictions. It's a significant decline in living standards. It was a very dark period for Romania.
It's a stark contrast to his early popularity.
Yeah.
How did he go from being this reformer to implementing such harsh policies?
Well, power can have a corrupting influence.
Yeah.
And as Ceausescu's grip on power tightened, his policies became increasingly repressive.
His paranoia also grew after the defection of Nicolae Ceaușescu,
Oh, yeah.
his head of intelligence in 1978.
1978.
That must have been a huge blow.
Ceaușescu's defection was a major embarrassment and a security breach. Yeah. I mean, he went on to publish a book exposing the inner workings of Ceausescu's regime,
Wow.
which further fueled his paranoia and distrust.
So how did he respond to this perceived threat?
He tightened security measures,
Okay.
expanded the powers of the Ceausescu, secured his secret police force,
Right.
and became even more controlling. His inner circle shrunk, his grip on information tightened.
It's the classic story of a leader becoming increasingly isolated and distrustful.
And it's around this time that his fascination with grand projects, particularly architectural ones,
Right.
really took hold.
You're talking about the systematization program, right?
Yes.
Tearing down historic neighborhoods to make way for those massive concrete apartment blocks.
Yeah.
And, of course, the infamous Palace of the Parliament.
Yes. The world's largest civilian administrative building.
It's a colossal structure.
It is.
And some see it as a testament to his grandiose ambitions. And perhaps his megalomania.
Perhaps.
Let's delve into that a bit.
Okay.
I mean, the palace, it almost feels like a physical embodiment of his personality cult.
You could definitely say that Ceausescu cultivated a very specific image.
Yeah.
He loved titles, symbols of power.
Right.
He bestowed upon himself the title of conductor, the leader.
Wow.
And he placed his wife Elena and other family members in powerful positions.
Creating kind of a dynasty within the Communist Party.
Yes. It wasn't just about ideology anymore. It was about raw power.
Right.
And the Palace of the Parliament, with its sheer size and extravagance, was a symbol of that power.
It's also interesting that he was so fixated on his image.
Yes.
Controlling how he was portrayed in the media and even trying to downplay his height
Yes.
in official photos.
It speaks to a certain insecurity, wouldn't you say?
Yeah.
A need for absolute control.
Right.
Not just over the country, but over how he was perceived.
Right.
He demanded perfection, and those who failed to meet his expectations often faced harsh consequences.
So by the late 1980s, Romania was a nation struggling under his increasingly oppressive rule.
Yes.
The economy was in shambles, people were suffering, and dissent was growing.
And yet Ceausescu seemed oblivious to the brewing storm.
Yeah.
He clung to power, convinced of his own greatness, until it all came crashing down in December 1989 with the Romanian Revolution.
That's right. A truly pivotal moment in history.
Yeah.
But before we dive into the revolution and its aftermath, let's take a moment to consider what we've learned so far.
Okay.
It's already a fascinating story, full of complexities and contradictions.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
I think what strikes me is how Ceausescu's story is a study in the intoxicating nature of power.
Yeah.
How someone who starts with perhaps good intentions can become so blinded by their own ambition,
Right.
and how that can lead to devastating consequences for an entire nation.
It's a reminder that power without checks and balances, without accountability, can easily become a force for destruction.
Absolutely. And in the next part of our deep dive, we'll explore how that power finally crumbled
Okay.
and what Ceausescu's legacy ultimately became.
So we left off with Romania, like on the brink of revolution.
Right.
And it's amazing how quickly things unraveled for Ceausescu.
Yeah, it really is. I mean,
One minute he's giving speeches, and
Yeah.
the next he's like fleeing for his life.
well, the seeds of the revolution were sown in Timișoara.
Okay.
It's a city in western Romania, and it all started with protests against the attempted eviction of Laszlo Tőkés.
Okay.
He was an ethnic Hungarian pastor who had been critical of the regime.
So those protests quickly escalated into a full-blown uprising.
Exactly. Ceausescu at the time was on a state visit to Iran.
Oh, wow.
And upon his return, he completely misjudged the situation.
Okay.
He gave a televised speech blaming the unrest on foreign interference.
Can you believe that?
It's like he was living in a completely different reality.
Yeah.
To make matters worse, he decided to stage a mass rally in Bucharest
Okay.
on December 21st, thinking that this would be a show of support for his leadership.
But that backfired spectacularly, didn't it?
Oh, it did. You can actually see the shock on his face in the video footage as the crowd starts booing and chanting Timișoara.
Wow.
It's a remarkable moment. The rally turned against him and chaos erupted.
So he actually tried to offer some economic concessions during that speech, right?
It did, yeah.
Yep.
He proposed a small increase in the minimum wage,
Oh, wow.
hoping to appease the crowd.
A little too late, perhaps.
Yeah, the people weren't having it.
Yeah.
They had reached their breaking point.
And this was the beginning of the end for him.
Absolutely. From that point on, things spiraled out of control. The protests spread to other cities, and the army incredibly began to defect, siding with the people.
And there's that mysterious death of his defense minister.
Oh, yeah.
Vasilu Malaya, do we know what really happened there?
Officially, it was ruled a suicide,
Okay.
but many believe that he was actually killed for refusing to fire on the protesters.
That makes sense. It must have been clear to those around Ceausescu that his time was up.
Absolutely. On December 22nd, realizing he had lost control, he attempted to flee Bucharest with his wife Elena in a helicopter.
Dramatic escape attempt, did they make it?
Not very far. The army, now firmly on the side of the revolution, grounded all flights.
Wow.
They were forced to land near Targoviet,
Yeah.
a city north of Bucharest, where they were captured.
So captured on December 22nd, and just 3 days later, executed on Christmas Day.
It was a swift and brutal end for a man who had ruled Romania with an iron fist for over 2 decades.
I mean, the trial itself has been criticized for being hasty and lacking due process.
That's true. It was a very short trial, held in a makeshift courtroom.
Wow.
The Ceausescus were charged with genocide and economic sabotage.
And they were defiant to the very end, weren't they?
Absolutely. Ceausescu refused to recognize the court's authority,
Wow.
insisting that he was still the legitimate president of Romania.
Oh, wow.
He seemed almost delusional, clinging to the last vestiges of his power.
But the court found them guilty, and they were sentenced to death.
Yes, the execution was carried out immediately after the trial by firing squad.
Wow.
It was a dramatic and controversial end to Ceausescu's reign.
There's actually video footage of the execution, isn't there?
There is, yes, it's grainy footage,
Yeah.
but it captures the swiftness and brutality of the event, and it was broadcast on Romanian television shortly after,
Wow.
a powerful symbol of the regime's collapse.
So Ceausescu, the man who once stood up to the Soviets and was initially seen as this reformer,
Yeah,
ends up executed by his own people.
quite a turn of events.
What a story.
Yeah.
I mean, his legacy is undeniably complex. He's remembered for his defiance of the Soviet Union,
Yeah.
but also for his brutal dictatorship
Right.
and the economic hardship he inflicted on his people.
He's a figure who evokes strong emotions in Romania to this day.
Yeah.
Some view him with nostalgia, remembering a time of stability,
Okay.
while others see him as a tyrant responsible for immense suffering.
And what about his wife, Elena?
Yeah.
I mean, she was a powerful figure in her own right.
She was Elena Ceaușescu, held several high-ranking positions in the government
Right.
and was deeply involved in the regime's policies.
Right.
Many saw her as even more ruthless than her husband.
It's often said that she was the real power behind the throne.
There's certainly evidence to support that claim.
Yeah.
She was ambitious, intelligent, and wielded considerable influence over Nicolae.
It's fascinating to consider how their relationship shaped their rule
Yeah.
and ultimately their downfall.
Their story is almost Shakespearean, a tale of ambition, power, and ultimately betrayal.
Speaking of betrayal,
Hmm.
I can't help but think back to the defection of Ion Mihai Pacepa.
Right.
I mean, it was a turning point. for Ceausescu and his regime.
It was a major breach of trust that shook Ceausescu to his core.
Yeah.
It fueled his paranoia and led to even tighter security measures.
Imagine having your closest confidant, your head of intelligence, defect to the enemy.
It must have been a devastating blow, both personally and politically.
Yeah.
It exposed the vulnerabilities of his regime and emboldened his opponents.
And to this day, there are still lingering questions about the extent of Pacepa's influence and the secrets he revealed to the West.
He's a controversial figure, but his defection undoubtedly played a role in the events that led to the Romanian Revolution.
It's incredible to think that the actions of one man could have such far-reaching consequences.
History's full of such examples.
Yeah.
Small events can trigger massive change, and individuals can have a profound impact on the course of nations.
It makes you wonder what might have happened if Pacepa hadn't defected.
Would the revolution have happened?
Yeah.
Would Ceausescu have clung to power longer? It's impossible to say for sure, but it's a fascinating thought experiment.
And speaking of fascinating, what about the economics of Ceausescu's Romania?
Yeah.
We touched on his disastrous oil refining plan.
Right.
But there's also the issue of his massive foreign debt.
Ah, yes, that debt. It's incredible how he managed to borrow so much money from Western banks.
Over $13 billion.
Yeah.
And it all started with good intentions, at least on the surface.
He wanted to modernize Romania's economy, make it a force to be reckoned with on the world stage.
Right.
But he overreached, took on too much risk, and failed to anticipate the changing global economic landscape.
And when those oil prices crashed, it all came crumbling down.
It did. The debt became an albatross around Romania's neck.
Yeah.
And Ceausescu's response was to implement those brutal austerity measures we discussed earlier.
Food rationing, energy shortages, decline in living standards. It's no wonder the people were so unhappy.
Those austerity measures were a key factor in fueling the discontent that led to the revolution.
It's a classic example of economic hardship leading to political instability.
Exactly. When people are struggling to put food on the table and keep their homes warm,
Yeah.
they're more likely to question the legitimacy of their government.
And Ceausescu, with his opulent lifestyle
Right.
and grandiose projects like the Palace of the Parliament,
Yeah.
was a perfect target for their anger.
He was seen as completely out of touch, more concerned with building palaces than with the suffering of his people.
It's a stark contrast, isn't it?
It is.
The dictator living in luxury, while his citizens are queuing for bread.
It's a recipe for revolution, and in Ceausescu's case, that revolution came swiftly and decisively.
It's also striking how quickly the international community turned on him. You know, he went from being courted by Western leaders to being condemned as a tyrant almost overnight.
His reputation plummeted in the final years of his rule as his human rights abuses became more widely known.
Yeah.
The image he had so carefully cultivated crumbled.
And that speech condemning the invasion of Czechoslovakia in '68, the one that earned him so much praise.
Yeah.
Well, that didn't age too well, did it?
Not at all. It became increasingly ironic as Ceausescu's own regime became more and more repressive.
So looking back, it's hard to reconcile the different versions of Ceausescu.
Yeah.
You know, the reformer, the dictator, the nationalist.
He's a figure of contradictions, a complex and ultimately tragic figure.
Yeah.
But before we get into his legacy, I think it's worth revisiting those grand architectural projects,
Okay.
the ones that literally reshaped the landscape of Romania.
Good point. The systematization program and the Palace of the Parliament were monumental undertakings.
They were, and they continue to shape how people view Ceausescu and his legacy today.
So we've been talking about Ceausescu's legacy.
Yeah.
And it sounds like there's no easy answer when it comes to how he's viewed in Romania today.
Well, not at all. I mean, there's so many layers to his legacy.
Yeah.
On the one hand, you have the undeniable brutality of his regime,
Right.
the political repression, the secret police, the horrific conditions in those orphanages, the economic hardship people endured. I mean,
Yeah.
these are scars that run deep.
And yet you mentioned that it's not simply black and white.
Right.
What are some of the other perspectives on his rule?
Well, some Romanian, especially older generations, remember a certain level of stability during his early years in power.
Okay.
There was a sense of national pride, a feeling that Romania was asserting itself on the world stage.
Right.
His defiance of the Soviet Union resonated with many people.
So there's a nostalgia for a time when things, at least on the surface, to be more predictable, more in control.
Exactly. And that nostalgia is often amplified by the challenges Romania has faced since the fall of communism.
Right.
The transition to a market economy was difficult, and many people experienced economic hardship and uncertainty.
So for something, the past even with its flaws, can seem more appealing than a present that feels unstable or uncertain.
It's a complex psychological phenomenon, for sure.
Yeah.
But it's important to remember that those feelings of nostalgia often overlook the very real suffering that took place under Ceausescu's rule.
Right. And it's crucial to separate those feelings of nostalgia from the historical realities of his regime.
Absolutely. And that's where education and open dialogue become so important.
Yeah.
It's about ensuring that younger generations who didn't experience Ceausescu's rule firsthand
Right.
understand the complexities of his legacy.
So they can learn from the past and hopefully avoid repeating his mistakes.
Exactly. Because understanding how a leader like Ceausescu came to power, how his policies impacted the country,
Right.
and ultimately how his regime collapsed, is essential for building a more democratic and resilient future.
And part of that understanding involves coming to terms with the physical reminders of his rule that are still very much a part of Romania's landscape.
Yeah.
Those massive concrete apartment blocks, the Bucuri, are a constant visual reminder of his systematization program.
They are, and they've become part of the fabric of Romanian cities, even as they evoke such mixed emotions.
Right.
Some see them as symbols of oppression, of a time when individuality was suppressed. Others view them more pragmatically as simply homes, places where people live their lives.
And some of those buildings have been renovated, modernized, rest.
Yes. There's been a movement to try and revitalize those spaces,
Wow.
to give them a new identity, to make them more livable.
Yeah.
It's almost like a physical manifestation of Romania's efforts to come to terms with its past,
Right.
to reclaim those spaces and infuse them with new meaning.
And then there's the Palace of the Parliament.
Oh, yes.
That colossal structure that continues to dominate Bucharest's skyline.
Yeah.
It's hard to imagine the city without it, even though it's such a potent symbol of Ceausescu's excesses.
It's a building that provokes strong reactions. Some see it as a national treasure,
Okay.
a testament to Romanian architectural skill and ambition.
Right.
Others view it as a monument to vanity, a reminder of a regime that prioritized grandiose projects over the well-being of its people.
It's almost like the palace itself embodies the contradictions of Ceausescu's legacy.
I think that's a great way to put it, because there's no single easy answer to the question of how our Ceausescu should be remembered.
Right.
He was a complex figure who did both good and terrible things.
And that complexity is reflected in the ways his legacy continues to shape Romania today.
Absolutely. From the political landscape to the built environment, Ceausescu's influence is still felt in profound ways.
Right.
And it's something that Romanians are actively grappling with as they navigate their present and build their future.
It's interesting to consider how his story resonates with events happening around the world today. The rise of populism, the erosion of democratic norms, the allure of strongman leaders. It feels like we're seeing echoes of the past in the present.
That's a really important point. Ceausescu's story isn't just a historical curiosity.
Right.
It's a cautionary tale that reminds us of the fragility of democracy,
Yeah.
the dangers of unchecked power, and the importance of vigilance in safeguarding our freedoms.
And it reminds us that history isn't just something that happened in the past.
It's a living force that shapes our present and our future.
Exactly. And by engaging with history, by grappling with its complexities, we can gain valuable insights into the challenges we face today.
So we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We have.
We've explored Ceausescu's rise to power, his controversial policies, his dramatic downfall, and his complex and enduring legacy. It's been a fascinating and thought-provoking journey. What stood out to you most from all of this information? Was it his audacious defiance of the Soviets, the tragic consequences of Decree 770, the sheer scale of his ambition, or perhaps something else entirely? It's a complex legacy for sure.
You know, for me, the most striking takeaway is how easily power can corrupt, even when it begins with seemingly good intentions. I mean, Ceausescu started as a reformer, someone who challenged the status quo. But over time, that allure of power, that desire for control, it warped his vision and led him down a dark path. It's a stark reminder that even the most charismatic leaders must be held accountable, and that the pursuit of grand visions must never come at the expense of human dignity and well-being.
That's a powerful thought to leave you with something to consider as we continue to grapple with the legacies of strong men and the ongoing struggle for freedom and democracy around the world. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.